Before we start this episode, I feel like we need to explain a little bit of what's happening here because there might be some confusion down the road during this episode. So, we got so many great questions from everybody on Twitter, which we really appreciate, and it really helps us, that we ended up recording while also including a guest of ours that you will find out about in a few minutes here. We ended up recording so much audio that we decided we needed to split it into two different episodes. So, I just want to clear up that confusion because the episode you are about to listen to is going to be focused on solely Rhys Hoskins and a couple of the other moves around the league, and then a little update on some of the Australian Winter League and some of the prospect rankings that have happened over the course of the last week or so. But what you aren't going to hear is the mailbag questions that all of you put out there. And what we're going to end up doing is we're going to release a separate episode that'll come out early next week where we answered all of your mailbag questions. But if we kept this as one episode, it would have been so long. There's no way anybody would have wanted to listen to it for that long. So we split it up, and I promise you we have answered every single question we got, and that'll come out early next week. So without further ado, here is the Rhys Hoskins episode. Welcome back to the Cream City Club podcast. I am Spencer Michaelis, and I'm here once again with Gunnar Amelunk. And today we are joined by our favorite guest, our first multi-time guest, our only guest, Jack Stern. Jack, how are you doing tonight?
I'd be doing a little better if I actually had some competition for the favorite guest award. Since I'm the only one, I feel like that doesn't mean a whole lot. But other than that, I'm doing pretty good.
Good. Gunnar, how about you?
Yeah, I'm doing good. We had a crazy, not that Jack actually cares, but we did have a crazy Wisconsin sports weekend, not just with the Brewers. So a lot to talk about, though, specifically with the Brewers. So excited to have Jack on.
Oh, yeah. If you are out there listening and you haven't yet subscribed, please take a moment to do so on whatever platform you are on. Follow us on Twitter at the Cream City Pod to stay up to date on these episode releases. Be sure to check out our giveaway that we are currently running. And today's episode is going to be somewhat of a mailbag type of episode focused on the Brewers.
Yep. And then coming up tonight, we got obviously what most people are probably here for and what they've been waiting for is the Rhys Hoskins news, which is why we had to call in the big guns with Jack Stern to get his full breakdown on that. And then equally as big, of course, we got the Christian Arroyo signing tonight, which again, that was not as big, but and then we just got to discuss a few other moves and rumors around the league, as well as Spencer mentioned the mailbag, which we got a ton of questions, which was nice to see that we got a lot of interaction this go around. So if this is a longer podcast, you guys can blame yourselves. And then Spencer and maybe a little bit of Jack here will be breaking down the Australian League and some of the new prospect rankings that we got. So without further ado, let's jump right into the main topic of Rhys Hoskins signing with the Brewers. So this happened Tuesday night, and he signed a 2-year deal, $34 million. And then obviously the second year is a player option. Let's just go right to Jack Stern here, why we brought him on. Jack, take this whatever way you want to take it to start out with. How you feeling about Rhys Hoskins with the Milwaukee Brewers?
Surprised. I wasn't really expecting that this was the kind of guy they were going to go for. I know there were a lot of people out there who listed Hoskins as a really good fit for this team, so those people can give themselves a little bit of a pat on the back for being right about that. But I figured that even with that slightly suppressed market coming off the ACL injury and missing an entire season's worth of games, I figured that he was probably going to want some kind of arrangement with a second year that he could opt into as kind of a security blanket on a pillow contract, just in case he comes back and things don't go super well for him in 2024. He's got some more money on the table that he can get for 2025. So it's not surprising that the deal he signed has that in there. It's a 2-year deal, and he can opt out after year 1 or he can opt into year 2. It's going to be his decision. I was surprised that the Brewers went there, though. I think that this was going to be a situation where they were going to try to stick to just a 1-year signing with someone. I thought maybe Garrett Cooper would be a good target for him, the kind of guy that they would go after. But they ended up going for a bigger fish than that. They went for Hoskins. They were willing to give him that second year. And the thing that I wrote about really in the immediate aftermath of this signing being reported was this is not a normal deal for the Brewers. We haven't really seen them do something like this, first under David Stearns and now under Matt Arnold. They have made some big splashes before, but those have always been for guys like Lorenzo Cain, Christian Yelich, now extending Jackson Chourio. When they do go all in a little bit more with spending some money, it's always for guys who have a bunch of different tools that can impact the game in all kinds of different ways, whether that's hitting for power, also making a little bit of contact, playing really good defense, being really fast, helping out on the bases. These are guys who don't necessarily need to slug to be valuable. Hoskins does not fall into that category. He's here to do one thing and one thing only. He's got to hit for power. And he, up until the time he got injured, was one of the most consistent power hitters in baseball. So if he does get back to that form, he very much fills a major need for the Brewers. But I do think there is a little bit of risk here, because if he comes off that knee injury and the swing isn't quite right, the mechanics aren't quite right, and the power isn't there, he pretty much becomes a replacement level player. And there is some risk that you could end up on the hook paying $34 million to a replacement level player. I don't think that's going to happen, but that risk is definitely there. So it is a little bit out of character for the Brewers to go after a guy like this, to commit that money to him. But it definitely fills a need, and I think the Brewers do deserve a little bit of credit for going out and trying to fill that need. They really needed some power in that lineup. That was a big reason why they got eliminated so swiftly in the wild card series last year. They got a lot of hits. They actually had a high batting average with runners in scoring position in that series, but they were only hitting singles, and it's just not an efficient way to score runs because you have to keep hitting singles at such a high rate to do that. Now they have a guy that can plug into the middle of that lineup who is presumably going to slug if everything works out.
Yeah, no, I'm with you on everything you said. I think, like you talked about, even looking at like the Yasmani Grandal deal or other 1-year deals, it's always been a mutual option or a team option, I suppose, but it's mostly been mutual options, which means if it does go poorly that year, they're able to, on the Brewers side, to say, we're not bringing you back. This time it's up to Hoskins. So it is a lot different, I think. When you look at it, I guess the one saving grace for me is if he does have a down year, he's probably still going to be one of the guys you would look at and be like, this is someone you're probably looking at as a pretty good bounce back candidate, one more year removed from the injury. So that makes me feel a little bit better about it. Obviously, if he has a bad year and you're paying him 17-ish, we don't know the breakdown of the contract yet, but an average value of 17 million, it's not going to feel great for the Brewers. It does help, I think, that it'll probably line up with the end of Corbin Burns' contract. We're probably talking the end of Willy Adames' contract, unless something changes. You can kind of fit it into that slot almost, where it's probably not going to kill them or really hamper them, but there's risk, like you said. The upside, though, is your middle of the order hitter that it's been lacking for the Brewers for a while now. Honestly, in terms of pure power, it's up there with anybody in baseball. It's huge power, especially righty bats. I think a big thing that we didn't really touch on is he has mashed against lefties, which the Brewers have struggled with as a team for a while. And he'll be in there every day against lefties, obviously. I am curious, either of you can take this too, but do we think they want him playing first regularly, or do you think he's going to spend a lot of time at DH?
Yeah, I'm not convinced that he's going to be at first base every day. And they've just talked with different fans and people on Twitter talking about how this is all going to work with the first base mix and the DH mix. And that was a conversation even before they signed Hoskins. But I think that he just kind of fits into sort of this rotating mix that they're just going to go with between first base, DH, corner outfield spots. I think Hoskins is going to get more DH time than Christian Yelich is, to be honest with you. I know a lot of people seem to think that they're just going to slide Yelich into the DH role almost full time so that they can get more playing time for the young outfielders, especially guys who are better defensively. But I don't really think that's the way it's going to shake out. I think Hoskins is actually going to get more time there than some other guys. He's not a good defender at first base. He has the bat, obviously, to hit in that DH spot. And the Brewers have really been a team that likes to have that flexibility of being able to move guys around. And I think that's still going to be a part of their identity moving forward under Pat Murphy. So I think it is going to be a situation where I wouldn't be surprised if Hoskins ends up more as kind of a 50-50 split between first base and DH. And the Brewers could always go out and get some other options to play there too. Tyler Black's probably going to be on the roster for most of the season. He can be part of that first base mix depending on how much time he gets at third. And the Brewers might not be done at that position either. That's something we can get to later. So this position player mix, it is still in flux a little bit. We're not really quite sure how it's all going to pan out. So there are a couple different ways they can pencil Hoskins into that lineup, but I do think there is going to be a lot of DH time.
Yeah. I had a bad take thinking about it now a couple episodes ago. Someone actually had a good question. They're like, what are the Brewers doing with this roster right now? We're kind of stuck in like this limbo of we're kind of going full young versus there's some obviously we had an opportunity here to get somebody, so we definitely had like a window to get somebody. But I was like, well, we're in a good spot. I don't want to really block the door for guys like Tyler Black, as you mentioned. But that would be kind of my main question now is I'm a big Tyler Black fan, obviously. So yeah, he plays a whole different other position. We assume that he'll be able to play third pretty decently enough to be able to stick there. But does this potentially close the door on like guys like that at all? 'Cause I know that's probably a question for most people. Like, is this at all concerning that like Tyler Black now might not have like a job potentially there open for him? Is maybe not as open as before then because we might think that he potentially could be stuck at like first base if he can't handle third base.
I think it again just really comes down to what they're going to do with some of the other guys on the roster who have options. Just how Black's defense looks when he comes up. It's all still in flux, so it is pretty early on. I don't know if there's a clear answer to that yet, but I wouldn't be surprised if we see a guy like maybe Andrew Monasterio not make the roster. I know the Brewers have a bunch of different utility types who are probably going to be shuffling on and off the roster throughout the year. Monasterio has options left. Owen Miller still has options left. Bryce Terang has options left. Oliver Dunn has options left. Like they have a lot of guys in that third base, second base mix who are probably going to be going up and down a little bit this year. So I think there is just going to be a little bit of a carousel with really just whoever's producing, whoever is holding their own defensively at certain positions. The constant obviously is that Hoskins is going to be in the lineup at all times, whether that's at first base or DH is again going to kind of depend on who else is on the roster and how everything else falls into place. But there's a lot of different directions the Brewers could go. There's a lot of different directions that it could take even throughout the course of the season. I don't think it's necessarily going to be a static mix this whole time, but if they do think that Black is ready for MLB at bats, and I think the consensus is that he is, and he comes up here and he produces, they're going to be able to find ways to get him into the lineup. They have a lot of flexibility with the other pieces on this roster. So he's going to be in the lineup in some capacity, I'm sure, as long as he hits. Hoskins is going to be in the lineup all the time. Aside from that, and Willie Adames at shortstop as well, obviously, but the rest of the infield, you're talking about a lot of moving pieces, a lot of guys who really project as slightly below average hitters. So it's probably going to be a lot of mixing and matching. That's something the Brewers have always done in past years, and I think it's going to be part of the equation to some extent again.
Yeah, Spencer and I talked about this is kind of a funny point. Just you spoke about the lineup a little bit, and I just, as I do, once we acquire a player, as everybody does, you start going through like a lineup and you start plugging guys in and you make it kind of look nice. And it's just crazy now that we actually do have a nice solid power bat, how much that lineup actually does look better. And of course, I stuck in Tyler Black in there batting fourth. But besides that, either way, I think it just changes the whole outlook of our lineup in general. Is if we got nothing else on this Rhys Hoskins news, I guess we could slide into the lesser of the signings with Christian Arroyo, because we talked about a little bit of maybe that fluctuating second base, third base. This is a guy who's a little bit more versatile. So is there any chance, this is a minor league deal that he signed, is there any chance that this guy could make the roster? And if he does, where do you kind of see him slotting in?
Yeah, I think there is a chance that he would make the roster, but I do think he's going to be at a pretty big disadvantage heading into spring, being that he won't be on the 40-man. They do have a lot of people that kind of fit that role, like you were hinting at, that he could potentially play some second, play some third. I'm guessing he has a pretty early opt-out in his contract, though, too. So it'll be interesting to see. If he has a really good spring, I could definitely see him making the team, or if they just doesn't have to be good performance in spring training, but if they like what they see from him when he shows up and they believe that he can at least handle the defense at those spots, because that hasn't been great in the majors, I could see him making the roster. I think for me, it's one of those signings that the Brewers make. It's a depth signing that kind of has the potential to improve you around the margins, but it's not something where you're expecting too much from him. I like the signing. I have no issue with it. I think it's at least worth a shot to give him. This is a guy who's before last year, 2 years in a row of being a league average or slightly above league average hitter. It's not the most pretty profile in the world for a hitter, but he was getting decent results for 2 years. And over the course of like 800 plate appearances between those years, it's hard to ignore that and say it was just all fluky. I think there's at least a pretty decent hitter in there. But yeah, I don't know, Jack, you have any other thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, there's no such thing as a bad minor league signing, and it's always good to have as much depth as you can. Personally, I don't see a spot for him on this roster. Pretty much right after the news of the signing broke, and I went and looked at some of the numbers and the profile a little bit. I think this is just a worse version of Owen Miller, and I'm already not a huge Owen Miller guy to begin with. I mean, you're talking about a guy who doesn't hit for power, plays around the infield. Defense is, not amazing, but he can probably hold his own at a couple different spots. Miller's actually probably a better defender than he is. He doesn't walk a lot, hits for singles. Maybe he'll hit some doubles in the gap, makes a decent amount of contact, but he doesn't hit the ball super hard. It's just a guy who, like I said, it's just seems to me like an even lesser version of Owen Miller's profile. Also a right-handed bat, just like Miller is. So I think that part of this does kind of tie into my belief that the Brewers do not trust Bryce Terang a whole lot. I don't trust Bryce Terang a whole lot. Based on what we saw from him as a rookie, and this was something I wrote about, he didn't really have the normal struggles you would see from a rookie. He could not hit a fastball to save his life, just could not get the bat around on fastballs and square him up, and that is a major concern, even for a first-year guy. So at this point, I don't expect Bryce Terang to ever hit well enough to play every day in the big leagues. I think the glove is good enough for him to be a bench guy, but I wouldn't be surprised if the Brewers feel the same way about him, and they are kind of trying to bring in just as much depth as they can for that second base position so that there's a little bit more of an all-out competition going on over there at the Keystone. And maybe that lights a fire under Terang, but also it just gives them some options for if they really don't think he's going to figure it out. Now they have some guys who have at least had success in the big leagues like Arroyo has, or a guy like Oliver Dunn who's got more upside in his offensive profile than Terang has. I think they're just trying to stockpile some options over there, and Arroyo is just the latest example.
You had me up until the point, literally right when we texted or when we got the notification that we got Christian Arroyo. I think literally the first thing I said was, at least he's better than Owen Miller. But but you're right, they do have a very similar probably hitting profile. And I think a couple years ago I might have mentioned that. I mean, he was like a former top prospectish, right? I think he was like on the Giants, like. Yep. He was in some bigger trades or whatever, even the Rays maybe too. I don't remember what he was, but a guy that I kind of said that I liked, but I kind of realized now that I need to start listing guys that I like in tiers, because when I say I like him, it doesn't mean I think he's going to be like the starting second baseman or whatever. But this kind of just reminds me of sort of like I mean, we had a lot of this really recently, like Luke Voigt or someone like that, where it's the guy where he had a good couple of years before that, and obviously he had not a similar profile at all in any sense, but a guy you're kind of just taking a chance on, and then we ended up having to pay Luke Voigt or whatever, but still it's kind of the same vibe. But I guess if we're done with that as well, we can move on to, we got some news about Devin Williams' contract, a little bit more of the specifics. So this year, Devin will be making $7 million, and then his club option next year, he'll be making $10.5 million with the $250,000 buyout. With those club options, they can increase by $1 million. If Williams throws 52 pitches, he gets an extra 200K, 52 games, I should say, extra 200K. I think he'll throw 52 pitches in that season, so that would be an easy money. But 57 games, 250K, 62 games, 250K, then 66 games, he gets 300K. So breaking this down a little bit, kind of like that same sort of vibe, and we're probably going to get into this type of discussion with Corbin Burns later on, but Dan Knutson on Twitter asked if we are NLCS favorites, or NLC favorites in 2025, which will be next season, what is the probability that we'll just kind of see it through and we'll just let him kind of play out his contract? Kind of similar to what we're going to be having this discussion with Corbin Burns, but what are the odds that we just kind of let this play out and we just let it see through?
I don't think those odds are very high. I think it's kind of 50-50 at this point. It does seem like since Matt Arnold took over and since the Brewers made that deal for Josh Hader, they are a little bit more reluctant to trade away some of their in-house talent. But I'm always going to be of the opinion that you should trade relievers because relievers have short shelf lives. Even some of the really good ones have short shelf lives. I think in Williams' case, too, he throws a pitch that is probably not great on his shoulder, that changeup screwball type pitch. I think that you really have to strongly consider it. I think that they will strongly consider it. So I do think it's a coin toss whether or not he finishes that contract in Milwaukee. I think trading relievers is also a much different beast than trading a starting pitcher or trading a shortstop like we're talking about with Burns and Adames. So part of it also depends on what the return is out there for a guy like that. I do think in recent years, teams have stopped giving up quite as much in trades for relievers compared to what we used to see a few years ago. But I would say right now it's a coin flip.
Yeah, I would agree. I would agree with that. I think, like you said, they have definitely been a little more hesitant. It feels like David Stearns would have traded Corbin Burns this offseason. In my mind, I feel like that would have happened. And I'm not saying that's better or worse necessarily. We're kind of going to find out on the fly. My opinion would have been still, we've talked about it before. I would have preferred a Burns trade. At this point, I'm not expecting that this offseason. I think it's you either hold him for the whole season or maybe we get to the deadline and the Brewers are kind of out of it and that's when he gets moved. But I would expect him to be a Brewer the rest of the season at this point, unless somebody comes in with some insane offer that we just can't refuse. I think the Hoskins deal for some people makes them think it's absolutely not happening. I don't know if it really changed anything. I think we're just getting deeper into the offseason where it would be hard to find any viable starting replacement for him, even to if they want to keep competing, which they clearly do. But for me, for Devin, like you said, I was going to bring up the shoulder. He's already had shoulder issues. This isn't even just the changeup is hard on the shoulders situation. He had a shoulder injury, and I think there's just a lot of risk involved with any reliever. And if you can get a legitimate package for him, then yes, I think they would trade him before the 2025 season. I am curious, and we'll touch on this with some of the questions we got later on. I think he'd be a qualifying offer candidate at the end of it, and they would be fine if he decided to accept that 20 million or whatever for 1 year. I don't think he would. I think he would go out and get his money because he's going to be 30-ish, 31 when he enters free agency. I think he's going to try and get that money on a longer term deal guaranteed. So that might open up the possibility of another pick for the Brewers if they decide to not trade him. The Padres are getting one for Hader, which we'll discuss that deal in a second too, but there's a lot to weigh in that scenario. And if they do plan on being super competitive in 2025 again, I could see them playing it out, but I would still, my guess would be the same as yours, is that they will end up moving him before the season. I don't think we will ever see a competing Brewers team make a move like they did with Hader again. Even though I have no issue with what happened there, I just don't think we're going to see that happen in season again. It's just the way the fans reacted and the blowback they got around the league for it was just, even though I think it was the right move, I think I also understand why they would be really hesitant to do it again. So
Yeah, I mean, you guys stole my main points there, but I was going to ask my dumb baseball question was going to be if we do get a prospect for him, just like we would maybe get for Corbin Burns, or we will get for Corbin Burns if he leaves. But as Jack said too, I just think maybe I'm not putting words in Jack's mouth here. I think this is what he meant, but I think bullpen guys maybe are a little bit easier to replace than starting pitchers a little bit. And knowing who the Brewers are, that's literally our bread and butter there is replacing bullpen pitchers. So I would be a lot less quote unquote scared if we traded Devin in the off season and had plenty of time to figure a plan out and we can go into the season. Really, no matter what our outlook is, I think he'd actually probably get a pretty good package, at least a decent package return. Package probably not even a great word. Maybe we get one good player, but as Spencer said too, I mean the clock just on his age alone is ticking. So this is probably your last crack at a good package to get for him too in that sense. So I would just be open to it, and I'm always going to be a guy for like the small market trades here. I'm always going to be the one who wants to trade these guys. Not that I don't have any loyalty or anything, but I just think that the value is probably a little bit too high versus what we could actually get and like replace for him. So, yeah. And then moving on, we don't have much probably to say on this deal, but just notable news around the league. Josh Hader signed a 5-year deal for $95 million. This is the largest present day value contract for a relief pitcher in baseball history. So, do you guys have any quick thoughts on this move? I know it kind of surprised me a little bit, just being for how much money it is, but and I think he did say that he's going to start pitching multiple innings now. I think Spencer told me that too, so it makes a little bit more sense why the value's up a little bit higher. But you guys have any quick thoughts on Josh Hader signing?
Yeah, I'm just really curious to see how Houston uses him. The report, like you talked about, and like Spencer has talked about, he supposedly is going to be willing to pitch multiple innings now that he got his money again. But it sounds kind of like they're going to put him in that ninth inning role and demote Ryan Presley down to a setup role, which I'm not sure that's the way I'd go about it, because guys who can pitch multiple innings at various points in the games and continue to be one of the best relievers in baseball, it's pretty rare to have a guy who's able to do that, because it is not easy to do that. And even Hader has admitted it's a lot easier for him to be a one inning, always ninth inning closer than to do what he did before early in his career with the Brewers. But he's proven that he can do it. And those guys are really rare. And I feel like if you have a chance to land a guy who can do that and he's in your bullpen and he's willing to do it again, you should let him do it, because there's a lot of value in that. The amount of flexibility that gives you, it's really, really valuable, because there's just no one else who can really do what he does in the role he used to fill at the level that he would pitch at in that role. And you also have a guy who's done a really nice job in the ninth inning in Ryan Presley. So if I'm Houston, I'm keeping Presley as your more traditional closer and thinking of putting Hader back in that more flexible role. But it kind of sounds like they're going to go the other way around instead and just put Hader in that one inning, ninth inning closer role. Presley's going to be a one inning, eighth inning guy. Maybe they do flip flop those guys a little bit depending on matchups in certain games, but it'll be really interesting to see how that bullpen comes together and how they decide to use these guys late in games.
Yeah, I agree with you that really that type of role where Andrew Miller was kind of the first guy we saw in recent history. Relievers used to be multi-inning guys, obviously, going back in the day, but it kind of made the return with a guy like Andrew Miller. And we saw how much value he was able to bring to the teams that he was on at that time, until he kind of got to St. Louis and they basically just made him their closer. And not only did he not pitch as well, which that was part of the issue there, but you could just see the value was not nearly the same once he got into that role. I feel like we saw that with Hader when he was here. We saw that it's just not nearly as valuable to a team to have a guy getting only 3 outs and finishing a game. And especially, if Padres fans were fed up with Hader, I know, because he wasn't even willing to go in and get 3 outs in the 8th. He was saying, no, I'm getting the 3 outs in the 9th or I'm not pitching. And the fact that he's willing to go back to that role now that he's talked about, he's somewhat open about it. He said he wants to get paid. And once he gets paid, the rumor has been that he would go back to that role. I agree with you, though. If the Astros don't use him in that role and just keep him in that closer role, I don't get why they signed him to this contract. It doesn't make sense to me. If he is that multi-inning guy, he's worth this, especially if he's pitching like he did last time he was in this role. If he's just a 3-out closer, I just don't see how this is worth it for them when they already had a guy like Presley, like you were talking about, and they've already had pretty decent back end of the pen guys. So I don't know. I was surprised he got that. Like we said, I think it changes a lot if he actually does pitch multiple innings. But when I first saw the news, that's what my expectation was, and now it sounds like they're not going to do it. So yeah, I don't know. It's interesting, and obviously it's got the Brewers connection, so it was a pretty big deal when we saw it. But yeah, I got nothing else on it.
Yeah, so congrats to Josh Hader. Do you got anything else, Jack, on this?
No, yeah,
Okay.
that should probably add, like, we're not saying that it's bad that he got paid. Like, good for him. He
No.
definitely earned this, regardless of what role he's going to pitch in when he's in Houston, because he's been the top reliever in baseball for several years running now, pretty much since the moment he broke into the league, outside of that rough 2022 season that he had. But it's good for him. He definitely earned this, regardless of how he gets used in Houston. But I do think from Houston's perspective, it is a little bit of a situation where it's like, you're paying him this much, he can do this, just let him do it, and don't get so caught up in sticking him into that traditional role.
Yeah, I was going to say he's also just getting that money just because he is good at baseball. So he's good at his job. And then also, let's kind of tie it back to that Devin Williams point that we had. I was kind of thinking like, oh, like $10.5 million, it feels kind of hefty to like a Brewers relief pitcher, but then here's Josh Hader getting $20 million on average basically for a season. So that makes us feel a little bit better, I guess, if Devin does stick around. So sliding on to a rumor that we actually got quite a bit of small tidbits of rumors here before we signed Rhys. So we were trying to nitpick which ones kind of survived those news. And this one I think does kind of survive past the Rhys news here. So we got an update on the Willy Adames trade front from John Morosi. He said that trade talks between other teams and the Brewers regarding Willy Adames have been pretty quiet. And he believes, and most people around the league believe that he'll remain with the Brewers. So I guess, do you guys, I mean, me and Spencer kind of beating this topic to a dead horse. We kind of believe that, if the trade's there, we should be able to take it if the package is good enough. But the risk and reward for who's next in line at shortstop is probably not going to be very appeasing to us. So maybe Jack, let's get your fresh opinion on what to do with Willy Adames.
Yeah, I mean, this is more of a non-update for me. I never thought Adames was likely to get traded. I always thought it was going to be Burns more so than Adames because, like you said, there's no other option in the organization really at this point to seriously take over that shortstop position. I know people like to say that we can trade Adames and slide Terang over there, but again, I don't think Terang is going to hit well enough for either second base or shortstop, even if the glove can play there. So beyond that, just knowing what Adames means to this team as well. And I also think something to consider too is I do think he's more open to signing an extension or remaining with the Brewers than Corbin Burns is. Corbin Burns has made it pretty clear for a while now that he really didn't have any intent of signing an extension with the Brewers unless they were really seriously competing with some other big market teams that were offering him the absolute best contracts. I think Adames might be a little bit more open to staying here and potentially taking a little bit of a discount just to stick around because he's talked a lot about how much he loves this team and he loves the fan base and loves the city, and the team and the fan base and the city all love him back. So I think just considering all of those factors, I don't think he was ever really at any point likely to be traded this offseason. And now it really seems like that's definitely not the case.
Yeah, we've talked about it a lot, as like Gunnar said, but it would have taken for me some sort of just monster deal that just blew the Brewers away, where they were probably getting a shortstop in return that they liked and was probably at the upper levels. That seemed like a pie in the sky trade situation no matter what. So it seemed very unlikely. I do agree with you that if you tell me that in the middle of spring training that Willy Adames signed an extension with the Brewers in a couple months, that would just not, it wouldn't surprise me. I could 100% see it happening. I think you laid out all the reasons for it, and I agree with all of that. I also think he is one of those in-between contract guys almost, where if he has another kind of down season versus like he did last year where it was a down season, his market will not, it'll be fine because of the defense and the idea that he could hit, but he's not going to go out and get a Dansby Swanson type contract if he has another year like he just had. If he has a big year, then yeah, he's probably looking at a potential contract in that range. He could kind of play it both ways and say, okay, I'm going to take some of this risk away from this upcoming season and take a deal that maybe falls in between the high and the low end of what he could end up getting, depending on how this goes. And I think that would make sense for him, and it would make sense for the Brewers. So I agree. I do think if anybody was going to get extended from this older group or people close to free agency, it always felt like it would be Willie. They're still below the payroll they've had in the past. Right now, they're going to have Corbin coming off the books like we talked about earlier. They're kind of getting so young that they're going to have a stretch here where they're not going to have too many high arbitration players for a few years. It seems like the right time to maybe give Willie that type of extension. Now, you can't go super long in terms of the years, I would say, but if they can go 5-6 years of a Willie extension at decent money, I could see that benefiting both sides. So that's kind of what I'll be on the lookout for. I'm interested in if the Brewers, I'm sure they've at least broached the subject with him. I'm curious how interested he would be in it. But like you said, if he's even 0.5% interested in it, I would say he's more interested in it than Corbin Burns is. So yeah, I will be super interested in seeing how that goes.
Yeah. And that was kind of my point too. I keep getting my points stolen. I write something down and I'm like, I got a good point, and then somebody steals it right before I say it. I wrote down payroll. I do think even with like, let's say in a worst case scenario, like Rhys gets hurt this year, then he picks up that option next year. As Spencer said, I think we're still in a decent shape we could handle whatever money that Willie would actually get too. And um, just a contract extension in general. Um, I'm a big Willie Adames fan, so I'd want him back, and that makes me excited that you guys think that's possible. So we will take that for sure. Um, and some rumors here that I don't think survived the Willie Adames, or not Willie Adames, Rhys Hoskins signing. Um, well, first we had a question here, not so much a question, but maybe a statement from Joe Simon Rasmussen. He said, "Can you poke them to make them do something?" And he got his exact wish, so you got somebody. But before this Rhys Hoskins signing happened, Robert Murray reported continued interest with Carlos Santana. Then, as Jack Stern pointed out earlier in this episode, Garrett Cooper's name kind of popped up too. So do you guys think that's still a possibility even with Rhys Hoskins, or do you think that door is kind of closed now?
Maybe there's a non-zero chance of Santana coming back if they really do value the defense that much, but I wouldn't say that's very likely at this point. I did think that Santana was the favorite to come back and play first base up until they signed Hoskins, but I think they're pretty much set now. I mean, they could go for, again, that defense a little bit, but they've got a lot of names now that they could rotate through first base, DH, corner, outfield, like we talked about earlier. And I'm also just not that excited about the prospect of bringing Carlos Santana back. It seems like a lot of people want to see him back next year, but I just don't see him being very productive. He's getting up there in age. He's going to be 37 or 38 next year. I can't remember which one it is at the moment, but he's getting up there in age. The quality of contact last year is not where it had been in the past. It's just a situation where I think you take what you got from him, but you should probably be looking forward and saying he's probably not going to be a productive hitter next year, even if the defense is still solid and first base is an offensively dominated position. You got a guy in Rhys Hoskins who can slug with the best of them, assuming he's healthy. Again, if you really do want that glove in the mix, maybe you can see if he's still willing to come back and play a little bit more of a part-time role, but they're also probably not going to sign a more established guy like that to be a bench first baseman. So I don't really see him coming back at this point. I'm not going to rule it out completely, but I wouldn't bet on it happening.
Yeah, I'm with you completely on that. I saw him as before. I mean, even once we heard Garrett Cooper's name, it felt like Santana was going to be the guy until Rhys came out of nowhere. I do think part of this also was that I think they valued Santana as a clubhouse leader quite a bit. And for what was going to be a pretty young team in general, I think that held some value. I think they got that in Rhys Hoskins as well. He is known as being a very, very good clubhouse person, somebody who's done well with younger players and stuff as he's come through. I think that that's not that big of a deal in front offices, but the Brewers seem to value that type of thing more than other teams do. So I think, like Jack said, I guess I can't completely rule it out, but I do think they like Jake Bauers as well. And I think they probably plan on him being the backup first baseman at this point, splitting some time with Rhys over there, possibly Black, like we talked about earlier. I think it would take him coming back on some ridiculously cheap contract where it's just like, hey, if it works out and we can find ways to use everybody correctly, great. If not, we can basically get rid of him for nothing. That's kind of the way I would look at it as a possibility still. But and Garrett Cooper, I would be pretty shocked at this point. That's basically like a worse version of Rhys Hoskins. So yeah, I would be surprised, but I guess not completely floored if they brought back Santana.
And then next, Robert also gave us a new tidbit here. I don't think this one's actually super affected by the Rhys news. And a little bit unusual from the Brewers here. I know we probably have some hot takes about this topic, but he mentioned that the Brewers were interested in Aroldis Chapman. And then that was before he obviously signed a 1-year deal for $10.5 million. Before I really say anything, I don't really want to steal anybody's thunder here. 'Cause I know we're going to have some hot takes on this one. So what do you think of the Brewers even being interested in Aroldis in general? Is that something that we're normally used to doing?
That doesn't sound very Brewers-like at all. That was at least my initial reaction when I heard about it, but Really, the only way this makes any kind of sense is if they think there is just some unbelievable upside there. And I think you could see that. Obviously, he got a lot of velocity back last year. I'm trying to remember off the top of my head. I think he had a strikeout rate over 40%. Don't quote me on that, but a lot of swing and miss. Made a mechanical change last year with his lower body that unlocks more velocity again. He was regularly throwing in the triple digits after he had dropped down to the upper 90s, drop down being a relative term there, dropped down to the upper 90s with the Yankees before that. So he's always struggled with walks a lot, and that really came back to bite him, especially after the trade to the Rangers. So I do wonder if the Brewers thought there was another mechanical tweak they could make that kind of had them salivating. Just the thought of, if we can get this guy down to even like a league average walk rate, like sky's the limit, and he could legitimately be one of the best relievers in baseball yet. But other than that, it just does not sound like the Brewers. They're not going to spend that much money on a free agent reliever, especially because, Gunnar, this is something you mentioned a little earlier. They're basically building bullpens on the fly almost every single year. Like there's a lot of turnover year to year because they know that they can pick these guys off the scrap heap, make some mechanical tweaks. They're really good at pitching development, so they can, change things with pitch mix, mechanics, unlock some more velocity and better pitch shapes. And that's how you get like a Yoel Piamps breaking out after the William Contreras trade, becoming a setup man. This is what they do, and this is how they build their bullpens, not by, spending a good amount of money on a 35, 36-year-old reliever. So it does seem out of the ordinary for him, but like I said, the only way it really makes a lot of sense to me is if they think there's just an insane amount of upside there that they really would not be able to find anywhere else. And maybe that was the case. We also don't know how competitive they were in Chapman's market. I know the Pirates ended up signing him for about $10 million. I don't think the Brewers were in at that price. Just speculatively, maybe they were thinking something more in the 6 or 7 million range, but it just does not sound like the Brewers to me that all that much.
Nope, I was gonna say the same thing, especially about like at 6 or 7 million, I could see it being a little more appealing. It's not going to break the bank, and like you said, the upside there is a pretty fun back end of the bullpen, which it already is pretty fun. You throw him in and you potentially get the walk rate down and he continues to hold the velo like he did last year. That could be a really, really fun back end of the pen. I do think it's kind of funny right after I talk about the Brewers being interested in good people and people who haven't had issues off the field very often. Then Aroldis Chapman pops up and he's had his issues away from the field. But I did see Ken Rosenthal's article today mention that the Royals were looking for relief help, and it sounded like he was saying they had checked in on Devin Williams. And it makes me wonder if the Brewers were looking at a possibility of saying, all right, we're going to take a haul for Devin, 2 years left on his deal, and potentially replace him with Chapman to try and shore up it would be almost like doing all of what the Hader trade was intending to do, but in 2 moves. Instead of Taylor Rogers being part of the trade, he would be signed as a free agent right after the trade. I started thinking if that was maybe part of why they checked in, but once they saw the price tag, they just said that we're not going to that level for him. I trust Robert Murray. I think he's probably one of the best at not just putting out BS. He normally gets legitimate info, and he doesn't put stuff out unless I do trust what he's putting out there. But my guess is this was more of we checked in because why not? Let's see what it costs, see what it might open up if we were able to sign him. And then once we saw that price tag, they were like, we're not going to be in at $10 million. We're not going double digit on that. Honestly, when I first saw this news, it was the first indication that maybe they were interested in adding some payroll in the form of a 1-year contract, or not the first indication, but it gave me a little more hope that it might happen. And then later that day, the Hoskins news broke. So, yeah, I mean, those were my thoughts on it. I just thought about how they might have thought it might open up some other opportunities for them if they signed him.
Yeah, my first thought I feel like was our lefty options in the bullpen right now. So we obviously have Hobby. That's how you pronounce it, right? I always feel like I mess it up. Hobie.
Hobie.
Hobie. Okay, good. I know Jack's a big fan of Hobie Milner.
You have the certified Hobie expert on your podcast, and you can't even say his
That's
name
why
right. So,
but we obviously got him, and then Brian Hudson this offseason as well. We feel like maybe, I don't want to put words in Jack's mouth, but I feel like maybe Hobie's kind of due for a little bit of a regression just because he had such a great year last year. I think he's going to have a good year again. But I think, yeah, if you could add a Chapman to that instead of like a little bit of a project with Hudson, maybe that makes a little bit of sense. And then speaking to more of that payroll topic that we had before, this was obviously before we had Rhys, but even with Rhys, I think we're sitting at like what, like $115 million. So still doable if you add $10 million to that. It's like we have stretched it further than that in the past before. So I don't think it's like super crazy. It's just, yeah, it just feels a little unorthodox for the Brewers. And then I think like worst case, if we say we did sign him, we could just trade him at the deadline or something and get something back, I guess, in a worst case scenario, whatever. But yeah, I mean, if that wraps up our Aroldis Chapman talk, we before Jack was invited on this podcast, we were just kind of dying for news at some point because we wanted a signing to happen or something, and Jack actually had a pretty good tweet here, and it made a lot of sense. Just kind of paraphrasing, Jack kind of threw out there maybe Matt Chapman's an option for us on a 1 year deal, with a little bit higher of a salary, kind of like a Rhys Hoskins type deal. Um, and obviously we like Matt Chapman. I think we've talked about him before on this podcast about not really even as like a hard option because we thought maybe he was going to get paid earlier in the offseason. But kind of like Jack said, maybe there's a window here now. We have a slighter. To me, we don't have a slight opening at third base because I want Tyler Black to be there, but in general, we have an opening at third base. Does the door kind of get closed now with Rhys being here? Or is this still kind of an option? Maybe kind of what Jack you're alluding to. Is this still a possibility that we could get Matt Chapman?
I mean, if you're talking about like a really high salary on a 1 year pill contract, I think Hoskins' salary definitely cuts into that. I don't think the Brewers are now going to be quite as willing to, pay him like $30 million and add that to their payroll. Cause that's kind of what I was thinking when I put this tweet out there. This was obviously before they signed Hoskins, and I wasn't really expecting them to do much of anything in free agency. I was expecting, again, maybe that Santana reunion for, $5 or $6 million or something. And then that pretty much puts a bow on their free agent spending just because this was not a great free agent market for them in terms of the hitters that they could spend on. But Chapman has been lingering on the market for a while. There hasn't really been a whole lot reported on what his market's looking like right now. And just the longer he sat out there, he was a guy who, just kind of looking into the season that he had last year, it was not one of his better seasons. He was not an amazing hitter. He's had some really good offensive seasons in the past. Last year, he wasn't anything special at the plate. His power went down, was still a really good defender at third base. So between that and still being on the market, it kind of made me start to wonder, maybe if the deals long term aren't quite where he wants them to be, maybe he is willing to take a gamble on, a short 1 year deal around, 30 million or something like that. Kind of similar to what the Brewers did with Yasmani Grandal a few years ago. That wasn't that expensive, but it's a similar concept where Chapman also has some really good looking peripheral numbers. He hits the ball about as hard as anyone, strikes out a lot, but makes a lot of loud contact, would give the Brewers that potential power bat in the middle of the order, fill a need at third base, plays really good defense over there too. So maybe it would have potentially been a situation where it could have made some sense for both sides, helps the Brewers. And I think the Brewers are always willing to add a pretty decent amount of payroll as long as it's short term. And I think we've seen them do that in the past. So if Chapman would have been open to it, I think they would have been open to it. And I do think he is a candidate to really have a monster season next year where, if he continues hitting the ball that hard and hits for a lot of power, continues to play top tier defense at third base, you're talking about a really, really, really good player. Even last year, he was worth like 3.5 wins despite not doing a ton offensively just because he plays such good defense. So I wouldn't count on it happening now that the Brewers have added about 17 million a year to that payroll in Rhys Hoskins, depending on how that contract breaks down with how that money is distributed. But it was a fun thought at the time. I thought it had a chance of happening. I don't like Matt Chapman on a long-term deal, and I do wonder if that's kind of why some teams seem to be not super willing to give him that long-term deal, because I do think as he gets older, you're already talking about a guy who swings and misses a lot, and if the bat speed starts to slow down, things could get really, really ugly in that kind of contract in a hurry. But I do think he has 1, maybe 2 super productive seasons left in him. So it was a fun possibility to throw out there. I wouldn't count on it happening now. I think even when I threw it out there, it was more, something that could happen, but not super likely. But It was fun to think about.
Yeah, the only thing I have on Chapman that I found super interesting, and I saw some people point it out, he has been a really, really hot starter for the last few years and had fantastic first halves, and then had really, really bad second halves all 3 years, which was interesting to me. I wouldn't have even thought about it, but thinking back, he's always been at like the All-Star break. It's been like, wow, Matt Chapman's having a really good year. And then at the end of the year, it's like, oh, he was okay. He had a solid season. He To me, that worries me with an older player that it's not like a case of not being in good shape. It's just an older player maybe wearing down a little bit and not being able to hold up for a whole season. But like you said, if it was out there and he was still willing to take a 1 year deal and the Brewers could make it work, I would 100% take him at third base. And I think you'd be able to figure out ways that, for Gunner's sake, I think you could put Tyler Black at second base in that type of lineup because you've got pretty good infield defense on that other side of the field if you have Chapman and Willy Adames. And you might be able to sacrifice a little bit of defense at second base to get Black's bat in the lineup over Terang's noodle. So I think if it was still out there, like you said, I doubt it. And it was probably always an unlikely scenario, but I don't see it happening. But if it is on the table and he's willing to do it, I would say the Brewers it'd be worthwhile to try and make room for it if they can find a way to make it work.
Yeah, I'd for sure be excited about it. One thing that we should probably mention too, I should have mentioned it with the Rhys Hoskins trade. If there's any Cubs fans listening, they're probably a little bit sad that we stole him away because he was kind of a guy that was rumored to be there. They might have had some interest, and I think Matt Chapman's probably a guy to watch, maybe with the Cubs. Maybe a little bit similar profile there, and I think I wouldn't be shocked if he did go to the Cubs or something like that. Not that I super care in that sense, but I would definitely take Matt Chapman on the Brewers. So that should wrap up our rumors and whatnot. And now we're going to slide into our gigantic news section here. We're going to call it a mailbag, which is just our Twitter questions kind of compiled here.
Okay, Gunner was not lying there. That is when we started recording all of our mailbag questions. It was later on that we realized that we had way too much. So that is the portion of the episode that is going to come out next week. For now, we're going to start talking about the Australian League and some of the prospect updates. And then you will catch all of those mailbag questions on the other side of the weekend. All right, just to wrap up, we just went through all the Rhys Hoskins news. We went through some of the other moves that happen around the league. But here's just a little information on prospects. As you all know, I enjoy giving any updates I can give on the minor league side of things. I enjoy that part of it a lot. So Taden Hall, again, not to toot my own horn, but I talked about him in our big prospect podcast about how I like him a lot. And if he can start tapping into power, I think there's a really solid, pretty interesting hitter there. Well, he's hit his first 5 professional home runs since we recorded that podcast, including 2 more just this past week. He finished their 40-game regular season down in the Australian League with an .852 OPS and those 5 homers, like I mentioned. Sam Gardner, we've talked about him on these every time. He inexcusably gave up a solo home run in his final outing of the season, which just skyrocketed his ERA up to 0.4. He finished the regular season with 22 2/3 innings, that 1 earned run that he allowed in his last outing. He only gave up 7 hits, 6 walks. He had a whip of .574, and he struck out 19.9 batters per 9 innings. Brian Fitzpatrick, a lefty, tall lefty, we've talked about him a few times, also down there, finished with a 3.74 ERA in 43 1/3 innings, whip of 1.015, and just over 10 strikeouts per 9. So all 3 of them had really solid campaigns. The playoff run actually is going to be starting up. It would be like 4 a.m. on Friday of the day after we record this Central Time. So that's starting soon. I think it's just a semifinal and a final. I don't know if it's a series or not, but they might have a few more games, but that's how they wrapped up their regular season. And then just to give kind of an update from the prospect side of things, and it's ranking season around the league right now. So MLB Pipeline is releasing their positional rankings at the moment. Jacob Mizorowski came in as the number 5 right-handed pitcher prospect in baseball. Robert Gasser was the number 9 left-handed pitcher prospect. Jefferson Cairo came in as the number 3 catcher. Tyler Black, number 5 third baseman. And then Jackson Churio is the number 1 outfield prospect in baseball. their top 100, I believe, is actually coming out tomorrow after recording this, so won't be able to touch on that in this episode, but I'm sure I will bring it up the next time we do a Brewer episode. Baseball Prospectus came out with their top 101 in the last few weeks here. Jackson Chourio, in his lowest ranking of anybody, he came in at number 6. Jefferson Quero came in at 38. Tyler Black at 58. And Jacob Misiorowski, in what I believe is also his lowest rating, came in at 63rd. So kind of lower on the Brewer system than some of the other platforms. But, I mean, a top 6 prospect in baseball is still pretty big deal. It's not like we're talking about them completely ripping on them, but they did have the fewest number on the top 100 as well so far. They did mention that Brock Wilken was in their next 10, and one of the writers even listed him as one of the 4 that they wanted to find a way to get into the list, but they couldn't fit him in. So it's pretty safe to assume that as soon as a couple of these guys graduate next year, Brock Wilken will probably find his way into that list as well. And then Baseball America came out with their top 100. This one, Jackson Chourio comes in at 2nd, behind only Jackson Holliday. Number 32, Jacob Misiorowski, so quite a bit higher on that ranking than Prospectus. Jefferson Quero's at 33, Tyler Black at 70, and then Robert Gasser sneaks in at 98. So I believe that this is the only top 100 that Gasser is on at the moment. They also listed as Jefferson Quero as one of their top 9 most likely to rise up the list next year. And given he's already at 33, that's pretty exciting. That means that as long as he's performing at AAA, I think they view him as a guy who could be a big time, probably, if they're saying he could be one of the bigger risers, you're probably looking at a guy that they think could be a top 10-ish prospect in baseball once they just see a little bit more probably from the bat in AAA. So pretty exciting. And a lot of these names were also included on the non-roster invitees to camp. So Tyler Black was invited, Wes Clark, Robert Gasser, Evan McKendry, who they got from the Rays for Alex Jackson at the trade deadline, a name I've mentioned, I think, at times before as someone that I think is pretty solid starter depth. Jacob Misiorowski was invited. Tobias Myers, who we talked about we'll talk about him in a future episode. Carlos F. Rodriguez was invited, and then Brock Wilken also. So Wilken, especially as a guy drafted last year, is pretty exciting. Obviously, they moved him very quickly to AA. They must believe that he could potentially make an impact right away next year after just a little bit more seasoning at the upper level. So all of those names are pretty interesting, and guys, you'll definitely want to, if you have an opportunity to watch them in spring, it'd be a fun time to watch them and see kind of how they stack up. And then, yeah, just to kind of wrap things up here, Gunnar, we got our random Brewers, so I'll let you kick that one off.
I've been waiting so long to be able to say this guy's name. It is Jim Edmonds of the St. Louis Cardinals. I know I didn't want to shout out a Cardinal that super early in the podcast. I didn't want people to leave the show, but no, I grew up and he was always a guy that I did like a lot. Kind of had the full package, like power, hitting, and is obviously everybody knows him from his web gems in center field and his defense. So I was a center fielder, at least I eventually became one, and he was like a kind of a weird reason for me to want to do that because I just loved watching him play growing up. And probably one of my favorite players, honestly. If I had to like make like a top 10 list from my childhood, I'd probably list him up there pretty well. So, and then of course he was a Brewer, so he even that's why I picked him. So, he had a little bit half a season stint with us, but that was when he was like 39 and maybe even 40 at that point. I think he took the year off before that, but even in that short stint, he actually was really good for us and played a good amount. So, and then we think we traded him to the Reds or something where he finished his career. So that was kind of a dream of mine to get him on the Brewers, and I remember being really excited about that. So, and I know Spencer's obviously a big fan of him as well. So just finally glad I was able to shout him out.
Yep. Nope. I've been leaving him alone for you because I knew that you wanted to use him. And I was a big Edmonds fan too. Probably him and Scott Rowland were like the two Cardinals that I always was like, I like you. I don't like any of you, but I like Edmonds and Rowland. Like I always appreciated them. No, I honestly, the weirdest part I think about the whole Edmonds situation is that he ended his career in, at the time, Miller Park, also on a home run when he tore his Achilles hitting a home run against the Brewers for the Reds after we had traded him there. So Yeah, he ended his career in our stadium, and he played for us on that in that same season. So definitely was a cool one when we ended up bringing him in. My pick is nowhere near the level of player that Jim Edmonds was, but for some reason I have a weird connection to Blake Lally. Um, he, I was actually going through old Facebook posts at one point not too long ago. Highly do not recommend. Do not do that. It is the most embarrassing thing you can possibly do to yourself. It is just not worth your time or effort. But I did find a post that I had talking about Blake Lally hitting a walk-off single that scored Josh Prince. So really, really big time random Brewer shout out there. I was pretty pumped up about it at the time. And then me being a Blake Lally fan, I play a lot of out of the park baseball. And of course, I had to make Blake Lally my manager because he is a AAA manager at the moment. And he was the manager of the Diamondbacks that won me about 4 World Series. So no big deal. But Blake Lally can manage. Um, at least in the virtual world. So, yeah, Blake, I don't know what drew me to Blake Lally, but for some reason he's one of the guys that always just stands out to me as like, yeah, I liked Blake Lally for no reason, but hey, he's out there living life, managing at the upper levels of the minors. I bet he's probably seen as a pretty decent managerial like prospect. He's so young, he's still in his 30s. Like, I bet he's
Mhm.
somebody that teams look at as a potential manager down the line. So, if he ever is, I'm going to be pretty pumped up about it.
I feel
Um,
like I remember him more from you telling me about your video game versus him actually playing on the Brewers. Like I kind of consider that a stat for him as a
yep,
manager that he won a couple rings with for you. So
yep,
for as much as you talked about it. So um, wow, he's just an incredible guy, well-rounded baseball mind.
yep. Especially when I'm controlling his mind, then he's a genius. Um, no, but I think that's going to wrap it up. So what we're going to end up doing here is you're going to hear an episode that we kind of split up an episode that we recorded with Jack Stern. So this particular episode you're going to hear right away. It's going to be breaking down the Rhys Hoskins deal, all of the stuff you just heard, obviously. And then we got that mailbag. We got all these great questions from everybody. And we spent so much time talking about it with Jack that we decided we have to split it up into 2 episodes. So we are going to release the mailbag exclusive episode next week, early next week. It might be Monday or Tuesday. We'll figure out what day we're going to release it. But just in case anybody who asked questions is wondering, that's where they're going to be. It's going to come out a few days later. This would have been such a long episode if we didn't split it up that we figured we should probably do that. So appreciate all of you who are listening. And just a reminder, as always, please like and subscribe, whatever platform you're listening on. Remember to follow us on Twitter at the Cream City Pod and to take part in our giveaway that's currently going on. Once we reach 100 followers, that's when that giveaway is going to actually be ran, and we're going to do our randomizer on one of the websites that does a random wheel or whatever. We'll put all the names in there and do it that way. And then, as always, please feel free to leave feedback for us on how we can get better. Thank you all for listening, and we will see you next time.